number one, Edgerton. So Edgerton was a photographer who mostly worked the 80s. He was very famous. He actually was one of the first people to use color photography and to really make it quite famous. Edgerton was very notable because of his milk drop photographs. So he did many images of drops. You can see some are milk. I think his very famous ones are milk, but this is a water with some colored background. This is a black and white image. I'm not sure what liquid that is, but you can see they are very similar. So they're formulaic. The horizon line is at the same point. The central drop is always centered in the middle of the picture plane. It's sort of the same distance away. The subject versus the lens is the same distance. So there's a lot of things that are very similar here. So that's what I mean by formulaic or a recipe. Other things to note about this, it was a very fast shutter speed, right? There's probably a ton of light in this room. These were all studio sets. And there was a ton of light and a very fast shutter speed. I particularly like these images because when you look so closely at this object, it stops becoming the drop and it starts to personify different things. So for these images, I see something like a chess piece, or maybe a person, a figure of some kind. They're very calming images to me, probably because they're so simple. They're very minimal images. I think there's a certain poetry to the movement of that drop. Once you get to these images, he actually calls them his coronet images. Coronet means crown. So it's this idea of the splash looking like a crown. So it's this beautiful sort of abstract distillation of shapes here. Okay, next up, Bernd and Hilla Becker. So this is a German couple, and they ran around finding all of the same architectural elements, right? So they would really intensely photograph one type of machinery or scene, and they would always print them. They made many an artist book, so that's mostly what they did, were artist books, and they would always print them in a grid on the same page. So when you look at a singular image, it doesn't strike you as being phenomenally impactful, but when you see them all together, you think, wow, these are all different places at different times, different purposes, but the similarities are astounding. Okay, even more of these, so a very German style house, right? And as you start to look at these, here's the conceptual part. It invokes this psychological reaction in myself that thinks, wow, we are all living in our own little boxes that look identical to all of our neighbors. We live in this world of systems. We are not as autonomous, I think, as we think we are or we would like to be. We are very much just tiny little Lego houses all lined up. The similarities in which we live are astounding, you know? And for me, I get this almost sense of discomfort or dread by thinking about that. You know, I am just the very same as my neighbor. We're all living in these tiny little boxes, you know. It really makes you question your originality, I think, at least in me. That's my personal reaction. You might have something a little different. This one is their most famous and I think beautiful, actually. These structures are so industrial and so brutal and just very, big and heavy and intimidating. But when they're all together like this, you really get the essence of this kind of beautiful round object. And it just becomes so odd to me in the sense of these shapes together. My dog is dreaming. Sorry about that. So all of these circles come together, you get all of these vertical pillars, and these for me just get broken down into all of the shapes with the staircase winding up. So for this particular set, I get a reaction that is sort of the poetry of these abstract shapes all together. and I'm able to distance myself from what they actually are, which is a brutal architectural element. Hiroshi Sugimoto, this will not be the last time that we talk about Sugimoto. These images are some of my favorites of his, and this is a long exposure, so this means the shutter was very slow, it was open for a long time, and these are all scenes of the ocean. So he pointed his camera at the ocean and he just let that shutter openly record all of the information that the ocean had to give, which ends up being this very beautiful kind of abstract image. I love the story behind it. If I just saw this image, I didn't know anything about it, I would think, oh, that's kind of interesting. But now that I know that this is a long exposure of the ocean, it means so much more to me. So that's sort of, again, that conceptual component. There's a reason behind it, there's a story, there's something that makes this important. Same thing here. I just get this sense of ease and calm. I feel like I could just take a breath while I look at this. And here's one that's a little faster. So we know that it is faster, the shutter speed is faster because we can see all the individual waves. So similar again, formulaic in the way that he has a high contrast between the top of the image and the bottom of the image. There's a really harsh horizon line that is kind of similarly placed amongst all of his images here. The horizon line is fairly central. It moves up just a slight bit on this one, but he's still very formulaic. Even though he's slightly shifted that shutter speed, it's still very formulaic. It still makes sense in this set. All right, Edward Weston. Edward Weston is a spicy topic. Very famous photographer, very phenomenal photographer. In his personal history, he was notable for not being a very kind person and shooting a lot of nude female models and constantly having romantic relationships with them, marrying them, and then very quickly moving on to the next one. So his personal life is a point of contention amongst many contemporary photographers, but no one can deny that this is a very masterful photograph. The lusciousness of these shadows, this is a shell, so the luscious way that he captured all of the lights and the shadows and the reflections and the nooks and the crannies and all of the gradient, all this beautiful detail that is within this relatively simple natural object is very, very, very masterful. Another shell here. When it is so simple, so quiet, so minimal, you really get caught up in all of those individual details. And again, formulaic, even though it's not the exact same scene, we're not looking at this shell in exactly the same way. They are shells, they are centrally composed, they have a black background, they're all lit very similarly. There's this one, there's a really harsh contrast from the bright whites to the dark blacks and really lovely kind of tonal gradients in between. So even though they're not all exactly the same, they're very, very similar. There's a recipe. He did the same thing with peppers. Okay, and this is one of my mentors. This is Bailey Russell. Bailey ran around New York City and captured all of the plastic bags that were caught in the trees. So he was just photographing the bags caught in trees. That was sort of his concept, his common thread, bags in trees. He was looking for bags in trees. And this is a square format. So we know that he was not shooting with one of our cameras, he was actually shooting with what is called a medium format camera, which creates the square compositions. So the square Instagram photos are actually throwback to the old medium format cameras. So bags in trees aimed towards the sky, there's no distracting elements in the background. So again, even though these aren't all exactly the same, they're quite similar. There's a recipe here. And this now is not a tree, this is some barbed wire, but it's still a bag caught up in the sky somewhere. Ooh, next up, Zlatanovsky. Diana she worked in a museum, and I believe she was an anthropologist in a museum. I could be wrong, but I do know that her research was in the catalogs and the collections of each museum. So there's a whole basement of museums that just house all of their collections. And so it is a natural history museum, but there are some historical artifacts as well. And so Diana took inspiration from her day job and she said, okay, well, what if I just line up all of these similar items, place them on a grid? So instead of taking a photo and placing the photo in a grid, she placed the individual item in the grid and created these giant portraits of like items. Combs. So some of these are from her daily life, and we'll see some also from her museum life. So this is an example of something in the museum's archives. Okay, and now we're into student examples. So students who have taken this and run with it in various ways. So this is Dylan Williams. Dylan was in my class last semester and also chose the sky. So Dylan liked to walk around. That's what made him happy, and he would bring his camera and he would sort of craft this practice of joy for himself. So he would take photos as he was on certain daily walks, and he just liked to be thoughtful with the camera while he was out. And so he thought, okay, well, what if the blue sky is my recipe? What if that is the formula? I take away all of the other distracting elements and I really focus on my subject against a blue sky. There was also another little thread of birds in there, which was kind of interesting and very thoughtfully composed as well. Okay, Madison Stroh. So Madison did a similar thing, but in the city. So was thinking about the architecture of living in a busy, bustling city. And Madison, you can see, chose to display these with a large background. So this is more the type of layout that we would see in a book. So a photo book might place things like this, or this might look like a photo magazine. You know, there's a lot of space. It's sort of a portrait style, so it reminds us of a page, and there's a lot of white border around it. So I think it's interesting that she created so many geometric shapes within the page and then also used the page itself to create even more geometry. So again, very formulaic. She had a recipe and she, for the most part, stuck to it. All right, and last example, this is Jamie Cornett. Jamie used the grid method, so it was important that all of these were together because this was a time sequence. So Jamie was thinking about the way that time works on natural elements, and for this purpose, she chose a flower, and she had that flower. She created a studio set, so she created this blank background, and she lit it, and every day she would take a photo of this flower at various stages of decomposition. At the end, it became very important that you see them all together as if it were a timeline. So there's some concept of thinking about maybe this is the impermanence of beauty, maybe this is aging, maybe this is decay, maybe this is life cycle. All of these things can be read from this image, and I would say that the grid as a whole is stronger than the part, right? So by viewing any one of these individually, it would be a nice photo, but we wouldn't read too much into it. When we see it all together and we know that this was a photo a day, then we start to get this background story and we start to be really thoughtful about the content. All right, so those are examples. Feel free to take those as inspiration. Think about what is important to you in your life. Think about how you could create your formula or your recipe, and also be thinking about how you might want to display it at the very end. Again, for this first week, it will be just shooting. And then next week I will upload a Lightroom demo, and at that point I will show you how to catalog and edit those, work through them, change file types for upload.